Hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I would like to welcome you to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual extension of the City Lights events calendar. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone peoples, aka the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Tonight, we are delighted to have with us Bushra Rehman, celebrating the publication of her new novel, Roses in the Mouth of a Lion, published by Flatiron Books. The New York Times Book Review has assigned the book an editor's choice. NPR calls it Best Book of the Year. It's also a Padma Lakshmi Book Club pick. Bushra Rehman is really a tremendously wonderful wordsmith, and really, it's such a great honor to have her with us tonight. She's co-editor of the book Colonize This, Young Women of Color in Today's Feminism, and the author of the poetry collection Mariana's Beauty Salon. Her work has appeared in numerous places. Joining her tonight in conversation is none other than Mayli Chai, who is no stranger to City Lights. We have hosted her before in the past. She's a really amazing wordsmith in her own right. She's the award-winning author of the short fiction collection Useful Phrases for Immigrants, as well as 10 other books. Her most recent publication is Tomorrow in Shanghai and Other Stories. She is associate professor in the creative writing department at San Francisco State University. So join us now in giving a warm welcome to Bushra Rehman and Mayli Chai. Welcome to City Lights.
Yay! I think we can only hear ourselves clapping because we're muted. Hi.
Hi.
Again.
I'm so excited to be in conversation with you, Bushra. I just love Roses in the Mouth of a Lion. Someone in chat said this was their favorite book of the year. I think it's my favorite book of 2 years. I've taught it in my MFA class at San Francisco State, and my students loved it as well. But I'm going to stop talking now because I know you want to read a section for people so they can hear it in your own voice and get a sense for people who haven't yet read it.
Yeah, and thank you, Mayli Chai, for all the support you've done with this book. And just so people, this is like the last event for the entire book tour, which started in December 22. So it's so meaningful to have it at City Lights. I shared this before. I mean, publisher of Howl, publisher of Mosa Labutoha's work. It is an honor to be having the last stop of the book tour here. I'm just going to read a really short part of the book from the end. Now, you may have heard this is a book about a queer Muslim girl from Queens, and this is a little bit later in the book where her and her secret girlfriend, they're both not out to their families, are taking the subway home from high school. They go to high school in Manhattan, and they're both heading back to Queens. And Angela is a Greek-Italian girl from the neighborhood, and Razia is a Pakistani Muslim girl from the neighborhood. Angela and I learned to rest our heads on each other's shoulders on our Friday train rides to Queens. We acted as if we were two friends tired from a grueling day at school, two girls who looked like they could be sisters, but who lived by listening to the steady thump-thump of each other's blood. We held hands under our sweaters or book bags, not caring if they got sweaty. Sometimes people raised their eyebrows at us. Then we shifted away, pretended we were just friends. We'd been hearing about attacks on the train and went more and more to the West Village to escape. One afternoon, I was resting my head on Angela's shoulders. All around, the sounds of the train, the bing-bong of the subway doors chiming, were bringing me to the edge of sleep. I thought of Adam and Eve. Eve had been created from Adam's rib. It's what my mother taught me. Didn't it make sense then for two ribs to come together like ribs really did? I saw Angela and me, with bleeding hearts in between our rib bones, the kind of hearts I used to see in the Loteria playing cards they sold in the bodega. When the bloody heart started beating, I realized I was falling asleep and woke with a start. We were at Queensboro Plaza. Angela smiled. I was just going to wake you up. I'm getting off. But I didn't want her to go. I'll wait with you. Sometimes I waited at the Queensboro Plaza stop where the N and 7 trains met on the platform. I'd stay until the N arrived, then take the 7 home. We got off, letting the long roaring worm of the 7 flash away with one last blast of heat. It was muggy on the platform, sweltering. After the frigidness of the subway, the heat was an insult. My face became sticky with sweat. I fanned my t-shirt with my jeans stuck uncomfortably to my thighs. All the beautiful people of Queens were wilting on the platform. An older lady with blue hair and a cart of groceries pushed past us. A subway worker was emptying the garbage in slow motion, releasing the smell of rot in the air. There was a group of boys with book bags strapped to their backs. They'd normally be shouting and laughing, but even they were subdued. Come on, I pulled Angela behind a dark green rusty pillar, plastered with subway advisories, spelling out the delays for the rest of the week. It's so hot, she said, but she didn't pull away. Ever since we'd started spending time in the West Village, we'd become bold. We kissed, and the silver glint of the buildings shone on us with mirror heat. Our atoms collided into each other. I felt Angela's heart beating against my chest. She tasted of peach vanilla iced tea and mint. A cicada perched somewhere close in a tree overhanging the plaza sang, as if this was its one night of glory at an open mic in the East Village. Out of nowhere, I smelled baby powder and rose oil. Then I heard a gasp. Matter realigned itself, and I turned in slow motion. It was my Aunty. Her face was wooden, her mouth a grim line. Angela and I instinctively jumped away from each other. Angela dropped my hand, but the stickiness from where our fingers had intertwined clung to my skin. Had she seen us? Had she seen us? The question hammered through my head. Every sense in my being sharpened. Assalamu alaikum, Aunty, I said in my calmest voice possible. I let my reputation stand behind me. All the years of being the perfect Muslim daughter, reading all my namazes and Quran, the only one from the neighborhood who'd gone into Stuyvesant, I pulled my disguise over me like an invisible shield. And I'll stop right there. So that's from later in the book. And that unleashes a series of events.
Well, thank you for reading that. It's just, I feel like that passage is so beautiful. You capture like the love of community, but also what's, dangerous about community, and also, but there's no real safe place for Razia, right? This is the 1980s. Homophobia is completely legal. And so I felt like the whole book is so good in how you capture the setting and the time period. And so one thing I wanted to talk to you about was how you did that, how you created the Corona Queens of this era on the page. Like, for example, you mix the gritty and the beauty so well. There's this passage in the beginning when you describe roses outside one of the houses as this house had so many roses. They grew up and over through the fence like they were some kind of convicts trying to scale the wall. And I just like made me smile when I read it. Can you talk about like your craft as a writer when you started this? Did you think I really have to like set up the community first? I had to set up Corona first, or did you start writing with Razia first? How did this begin?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, so there were two different books that I was writing simultaneously, and they kind of combined into one. One was a book about Razia, a queer Muslim, runaway who's like thinks she's Jack Kerouac and travels around the country hitchhiking and taking Greyhound buses and getting into all kinds of adventures. And then I was at the same time teaching these writing workshops in public schools all through New York City, working with young children and through Teachers and Writers Collaborative, which was an incredible organization started by, June Jordan, Kenneth Koch, Merle Rukeyser was one of, it was an incredible org where published poets would go into the public schools to make up for the lack of arts education in public schools in New York City. And with the children there, I was doing the classic Where I'm From poem, which we know that question, where are you from, is so loaded. But the Where I'm From poem, I feel like turns that on its end and like you have pride in where you're from. And I loved how all the children would just like have so much pride in their neighborhood. So one day I just started writing a poem about where I'm from, which is Corona, Queens. That's where I grew up. And suddenly all these memories started coming up, and I still thought they were two separate books. And then at some point, a friend of mine said, why don't you try to put these together? And that's how it all kind of came, it all worked out that the book was created.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Tommy Orange came to San Francisco State when They Are There first came out. And he said that, he had also started writing this book, and then the thing that pulled it together was he was working with high school students in like Oakland and the Bay Area, and he started the thing that became the preface, the We Voice About Urban Indians, and it was that sense of place and who we are that kind of then launched into They're There. So it's so interesting to hear that also is kind of maybe the origins of Roses in the Mouth of a Lion.
Yeah.
Great minds thinking alike. Another thing you mentioned is your poetry, and that is something that jumped out to me as a reader. It's just your use of symbolism and imagery. It really struck me as quite poetic. And I was thinking of descriptions like, You're describing a hair salon. It was like stepping into another world, a forest of sound, women laughing like birds and trees. Or in Razia, as a child is buying candy from a bodega, and she says, I throw our coins across the counter. They fell and spun, shone like planets. Can you talk about what it was like transitioning from writing poetry to writing prose to writing this novel?
Yeah, so I was in the 90s, I was a spoken word poet in the East Village. And I know spoken word gets like, made fun of sometimes, but it really was this incredibly powerful political space, and it was a time when mostly like BIPOC poets, we were getting a mic and we were getting to share everything that we wanted to share. So I was a poet performing in these spaces at the New Rican, at Bar 13. And what started to happen was that in between each poem, I would tell a story about the poem. And so the poems were, again, all about Corona. And I would start sharing a story or a vignette. And then again, someone was like, are you sure you just want to write poetry? Maybe you want to try some prose. And so I started writing down the stories. And you'll see, even when you read the book, some of the earlier chapters are more vignette-y, less formed, and then the later chapters are more have a plot and a through line. And it's because I was learning how to write fiction as I was writing it. And I will say fiction is a lot harder than poetry. Like, I feel like poetry, I could get inspired, write something in a day and I'm done and I feel a sense of accomplishment, whereas this book took me almost 20 years to write. So it's definitely a longer process, and it does help to take classes and have a community that'll keep you sustained during that long journey of writing a novel, which, as you know this very well too.
I personally think I don't write poetry, so for me poetry is like impossible. So it's interesting to hear that you think that poetry is easier. But I definitely see the influence of the poet in just your beautiful, exquisite descriptions. One thing I want to talk about also is just like your attention to detail as a queer coming of age novel. Someone else had put in the chat that the only safe space for these two girls is with their hands touching, right? And like one of the things you show really well in the 80s is like the AIDS crisis is raging. Homophobia is completely legal. It is completely legal to discriminate against and to torture and to be mean to queer teens. And Razia's problems, she grows up in a fairly conservative community, first generation immigrants, even the prestigious high school in Manhattan, totally homophobic, right? But then you show there's so much love and humor and community forming, and that she finds, including in this one scene I love at the Strand bookstore. And so I was wondering if you could talk about your decision to, include the Strand. I think we are, doing this event for City Lights. I think it's important to show our love for
Yes.
indie bookstores. Can you talk about why
Oh
you
my God.
chose to include the Strand in this novel?
Yeah. Well, so much. I mean, I think it's just, I mean, this is a historical novel, even though it just was a few decades ago. It was before the internet. It was, as you say, when it was completely legal, although, our rights are being taken away as we speak, which hopefully we are not going to let that happen. But, all the big, George Michael was in the closet. He's a big figure. Whitney Houston was in the closet. Even Boy George, people were like, oh, Boy George is not gay. And we're like, wait, what? And so there was this way that Razia, and then she's growing up in a religious community in the outer boroughs, which again, if you were in the outer boroughs, you were not in Manhattan. It was like completely different cities, And so she doesn't know why she feels different. She just knows she feels different. But there's nothing for her to look at and say, oh, I'm like that. Until she meets Angela, and then she goes to the Strand bookstore and meets the iconic bookseller, Ben McFall, who, if you have not heard of him, Google him, Ben McFall. He worked at the Strand for 40 years. And I worked at the Strand in the 90s. That was, at that time I had like a shaved head and like everything I owned was ripped and wrinkled, and they were like the only place that would hire me because I like passed the fiction test with like flying colors. And so they put me in the fiction section with Ben, and he became my mentor. He was a gay man who lived with the AIDS crisis. His lover, who he was buried with. Ben passed away in 2021, December 2021. And we stayed in touch from the 90s until, the day before he passed away. And he got to read that chapter before he passed away. And I asked his permission if I could write about him. And he said, of course, I think he would be loved to be, in a book in the fiction section. And he's going to be the next book. The sequel is going to take place primarily in the Strand. And because this book ends in 1989, I do a lot of research, like internet research, but also deep research of books, libraries, bookstores, where I was like, what was happening in 1989? And I was like, oh, of course, the Satanic Verses controversy was happening in 1999. So what would it feel like to be a Muslim girl working at a bookstore at that moment, a girl who dreams of being a writer, who doesn't present as Muslim, so people are saying all kinds of Islamophobic, horrible things around her. And so like, what is that space between not, being against Islamophobia and against censorship? So much of what's going to happen in this book is about those liminal spaces. And Razia meets some other queer South Asian Muslim artists at the Strand, because that was a meeting place, and the South Asian Women's Creative Collective, the founder literally would go to the Strand and like approach people and be like, hey, are you an artist? Come to my meeting at the Asian American Writers Workshop. Like that's how she would find people, So and that's one of the ways I found out about it. And so I think that there's a way that she then discovers this queer South Asian community, this artist community, and kind of blossoms. So again, there's a third space. It's not just like, okay, you must assimilate into this like Western culture, or leave behind your religious community. It's like, no, you can create these third spaces. And just this week, I was writing a chapter about Sinead O'Connor, who is,
I
or
love Sinead.
Shahada Sadakat, because she reverted to Islam because it was, her death anniversary. And so I'm mixing up time because 1992 is when she was on SNL and, ripped up the picture of the Pope. So again, like that's going to be in the book. Like, so I love talking about things in pop culture and literary culture, and then just playing with them, and so using real events and then building scenes around them.
And what you mentioned also is about creating community, right? There's a third space, there's another space. Like, what I love about this book is you just avoid stereotypes so well, and you don't make this like, this is a Pakistani-American girl, queer, coming of age. She's in a very gritty working class neighborhood, and there's so many ways this could have gone wrong, right? This could have been used to bash her Muslim community, or to bash working class spaces, or to pretend that the only way is, as you say, assimilation. But no, she finds all these spaces and creates all these spaces and creates all these communities. So it can show that one does not have to reject everything about oneself and one's community. I just thought that was so beautifully done. And that kind of opens to another question I had for you about your really richly detailed characters. You have even your smallest character, like the bookseller at the Strand, or like the kid who in the opening seems like he's going to be a juvenile delinquent, Julio. You never allow people to be defined by like their worst moment. You always open them up, and they have these really interesting backstories, even if they're just a tiny character, like maybe who gets like one big scene. And that's made this feel very real to me. So I was going to ask if you could talk about just your writing process for characterization. How do you start with characters? Do you have like an idea? Do you have like an image? Do you have an arc in mind?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about, it's approaching every character with love, approaching every character with love and dimensionality. And this is something I learned from Dorothy Allison, who actually Bastard Out of Carolina was one of the first books Ben McFall ever gave me to read, and was like, you have to read this book, like now. And I think, and she says, you only betray the people in your lives by using them in small ways. If you really tell all you can about a character and dimensionalize them, you're not committing an act of betrayal. And since the seeds of so many of my characters do come from real people, I try so much to dimensionalize them. Like in that scene that we see, that I read at the beginning, you know, if you go just a few pages in, Aunty basically comes out to Razia, you know, and it's like, well, I had a girlfriend in Pakistan, but I couldn't stay with her, you know, and that's actually a very common thing that a lot of us Desis joke about is like when your parents are out there, like, well, everyone had a boyfriend or a girlfriend. That's just normal. Like, but then you have to get married and you have to, you know, then it's like, it's about the family unit, right? And survival, right? And so, but there, you know, so there's ways that I feel like there is just this way that I can approach every character with love. And I do have an amazing writing community and writing partners who will let me know when someone is being used in a small way. And then I can add more, tell more. And sometimes what I do is I let the characters write me letters, you know? And with Julio, I would have, you know, I a few times did a thing where he would write, like the character would write fictional letters to me of like, what do you want to say, you know? And in one of the letters, you know, he was like, you think you're better than me, you know? And so that becomes like a whole part that becomes something he says in the book, you know? So I think sometimes it's about letting the characters become real and taking our author, like, you know, letting go as an author and letting the characters become.
That's one of the things, again, I loved about this book is that I felt like I could go down this street and go follow any one of these characters and there'd be a whole other story, a whole other novel. So I'm excited about the idea of the sequel. I just feel like it just felt so lived and so real. And that is surprisingly and sadly kind of rare in novels. Sometimes I feel like, you know, I'm being directed in some way and like people are symbolic. And I felt like no one was just there for symbolism. They just lived and they're living and breathing their space. And we get to meet them for a little bit in this scene, but then they're going on and having their life.
Thank
Do
you.
you, besides your protagonist, did you have a favorite character as you were working on the book?
Well, Taslima, who is the best friend, is definitely one of my favorite characters and people. I think that the character of Taslima, it's her best friend. Even though Taslima doesn't understand Razia completely and is slightly homophobic, like she still shows up for Razia in different ways. And she's just so funny, you know. That basically Razia has her home, but then she basically lives at her best friend's home. You know, I think that that's something that can be sometimes very common for people who they feel less comfortable in their own house and they just spend all their time at someone else's house. And those parents take them in and those parents, and I, as a parent, I try to be that parent now, you know, and you just like create like a safe haven for kids. And so I think it's that whole, Taslima's whole family, you know, they're just very, very special people. And, you know, sometimes, again, I would let some, if it was based on real people, I would let them read the drafts. I would let them give comments. And, you know, and I'll say that, you know, so much like if people go to Corona, they will, if they're not insiders, they will just see this like impoverished, under-resourced community. And so much of my desire to write about it in beautiful language was the desire to share the beauty of the neighborhood. And I'll say, and I think this will go in the next book, I just for the first time went to Louis Armstrong's house. He lived in Corona.
Oh,
And it turns out, you know, that when he's singing "It's a Wonderful World," he's singing about Corona, you know. And I was like in his den. Just went to the tour, and I literally I was embarrassed because I was like crying so much. Like I didn't. It was like this is another person that gets it, that gets why Corona is so amazing, because there's people from all over the world living together in I mean, not always harmony, but mostly harmony, you know, like Queens shows that it is possible for us to live with people from everywhere, every religion, every background, and be neighborly and kind to each other. So the fact that Louis Armstrong lived there and got it, and I went to Louis Armstrong Middle School, which I didn't then learn that him and his wife founded. I was like, oh my God, he's like I'm directly linked and benefited from his, you know, patronage of the children in the community, you know. So
just hearing you say this makes me want to cry. I mean, I feel like maybe
I
that's
was
what I
crying so
first
much. It's so
responded
embarrassing.
to about this book. You know, my grandparents, when they first came to the United States, well, actually, they lived and died in New York City, and they, you know, lived in we say, a rough neighborhood, came in 1955, and, you know, it's what they could afford as refugees. And, you know, this is pre-gentrified New York. So when I visited them as a child in the 70s, you know, the New York I saw was the New York you described, right? It's almost that it was just a little bit earlier, but it's like it's very gritty. It was very gritty. You know, this is the city where the white wealthy people didn't want to live, but that meant everyone else could, right?
You could have families there.
You could have families. You could have refugees, you could have, you know, all kinds of survivors, and they're all, you know, basically getting along, right? But it was very gritty. I remember there were all the sex workers on my grandparents' street, but they didn't bother us. What did they care? You're not going to bother Chinese old refugees. You know, they had an 8th floor that most of the time their landlord wouldn't fix the elevators. They'd have to, you know, my grandfather coming home from going to the grocery store, like in Chinatown, they'd have to stop and he'd leave some of the groceries on each landing as he went up, and then he'd come back down and get them up as he had energy. And like, no one bothered each other, right? Why would you? But it was gritty, and that's what I felt in the way you described this community, right? Like even like when you say all the beautiful people of Queens, she sees them, right? And it's like it's not typically beautiful, but it is beautiful. It's through your eyes and through her eyes.
Yes.
So
and children can see beauty in everything. And so there is like a child's lens on all of it. And I think that, it's true. But there's a lot of really harsh things that happen in the book. And that sometimes even my editor was like, well, do we have to include this? This is like really horrible. And I said, well, it happens, and I'm writing for people who may have experienced something similar, you know, so that they can again see themselves and see a certain experience represented. So yeah, it's very real. And I forget what I was. Ask your next question. I had a thought. But
I'll go on to the next question. Oh well. So what was the most difficult part of the book to write?
I mean, so much of it was difficult to write because again, there's like really hard things that happen. There is an animal that is killed. There is, you know, sexual violence. There is that's alluded to, not like there's you know, I think the hardest part was the end, which I don't know if it's like almost a year and a half that the book's out, if we can give spoilers, but I will,
don't tell the ending. Don't tell the ending.
I won't say the ending. But I think the end was the hardest part to write. The end was the hardest part to write. And also, you know, as I was writing it, you know, my father was passing away. So I was writing, and you know, the parts about him just felt so tender and so meaningful and so difficult to write as well. So there was a lot of pain that I put in there. But I do feel, and I teach writing workshops, I do feel that there is something about taking your pain and crafting it into something different, like not just a journal entry, but a poem or a work of art. And it's almost like it's transformed and it's released. You know, sometimes when people meet me, they're like, Bushra, you seem so happy. And I'm like, that's because I take all my pain and I do something with it. I don't just like let it sit and fester. I create things from it. But sometimes my daughter will hear me talking to people from my neighborhood, and it's like every other word is a curse. And she's like, who are you talking to? And I'm like, I was talking to my friend from high school. And she's like, I never hear you curse. And I'm like, it just kind of comes out. Just comes out when I talk to my childhood friends.
I mean, thank you for talking about that so honestly. I feel like you do capture that, the beauty, the harshness, and I can understand why the ending would be the hardest part. The hardest part, I mean, I won't say anything more because I don't want to give any spoilers. I was wondering, would you be willing to read from pages 6 and 7? It's just maybe one paragraph. It starts with, I'd known Saima since she and I were born, and even before, because our fathers had been best friends in Pakistan. I love this because you, in this one paragraph, you encapsulate the fathers so well, and this kind of journey, like they've taken this amazing journey to America for their family's sake, but they give up so much, right? And this is something I want to talk to you about also, about just how you characterize them. It's so empathetically, and you show a lot of pain, but it's also really funny.
I do, let me find it. I do have the book up here. I know the part that you're talking about. I think, so there is something about, you know, what I learned from my parents, you know, immigrant community was how to survive as friends as your chosen family. And that's such a queer thing to do, you know, because when they came, it was the 70s and they couldn't bring their families over, you know. If you haven't read the book, The Karma of Brown Folk, I highly recommend it. I mean, it is a book about the way that the South Asians, among other Asians, were described as a model minority, but it was an anti-Black racist way to describe them, because if they're the model minority, like, then who's
Yes.
not the model
Yeah.
minority, you know? And so, but when South Asians first came, first we were banned from the country until like the 60s. And then only scientists could come. So, you know, my dad was the youngest of, you know, 12 kids, was scientists, but like his other family members were not, you know. Everyone had pooled together to, like, you know, get him an education. So there was no family. And so best friends, his best friend who he went to university with, that those became, you know, our family. And so it's, again, it's not memoir, but there's some things that do come from real life. Let me find that part. You're saying it's page 6 and 7.
It's a one sentence on the bottom of 6.
I see.
It's a chapter that begins skin.
I see. I'd known Saima since she and I were born, and even before, because our fathers had been best friends in Pakistan. They'd met at Peshawar University and had come to America together with their tight-fitting British suits, curly dark hair, and sunglasses. In Pakistan, they'd been scientists and worn white lab coats, but in Corona, they worked in stores. Now, Saima's father wore tight pants and shiny shirts while he sold radios, VCRs, and illegal copies of Bollywood movies. My father wore his lab coat as a butcher at his goshtagan, Corona halal meats. Whenever I visited him, his lab coat would be covered with blood.
I mean, that's just so beautiful. You encapsulate the whole journey of a generation in that one sentence, and it's so visual, and it's sad too, right? Because they were the scientists, they come and they don't get that kind of life in the United States.
Yeah, because people are given visas but not jobs.
Yes.
And then it's like, here, just figure this out. And it's like, no one's
got to
hiring.
make a living.
Again, the racism, you know, was so intense back then. And they were like the first, you know, like immigration had just opened up. They were like the first Pakistanis. And so every uncle or auntie I had was just someone that they met, like literally like on the street, where they were like, are you Pakistani? You know, so I feel like there is this thing that sometimes, like, you know, people are like, where are you? You know, are you Pakistani? I can understand why my parents did that. Yeah.
But anyway, that was beautiful. So for people who haven't read it,
you.
I just wanted to point that out, because I just think it's one of the every paragraph is beautiful, but that just haunts me so much.
Thank you.
So yeah, you kind of touched on this, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about your research, because this is, you know, this isn't the present day. It's the 1980s, but like I lived through the 80s, and like, man, you got all the details right. Like how did you do that? Like, how did you do them? Did you start writing first, research as you're writing, or start researching and then just stop after a while?
Well, I mean, even though the internet did not exist in the timeline of the book, it did exist now, so I was able to really use it. Like, for example, you know, I would watch I mean, this was like, I would go down like pop culture wormholes, like watching like all of George Michael's videos and Whitney Houston. And I would, you know, read books about the 80s, but a lot of it was also, you know, because I was still living in New York City, I would just walk around and take photographs of every place I wanted to write about. Because as a, you know, New Yorker, I knew I also couldn't stand around and stare at people or places for too long. So I would just like walk around and just photograph all the places that I wanted to write about, whether it was Grand Central, the Metropolitan Museum, all the different locations, Corona, and then write from the photographs. So there was a way that I did that kind of research. Like I like that place on the 7 train. I stood on that platform, again, took pictures. I would ride the 7 train back and forth, writing and editing. I mean, I do a lot of writing and editing on the subway. That is my focused spot place for some reason, because maybe I'm trying to block out the rest of the world so much that it's like really deep focus when I'm on the subway. But yeah, I would actually follow Razia's route wherever she was. And I would just use, I found photographs from the 80s on the Staten Island Ferry. So the Staten Island Ferry chapter, there are actually photographs from that time. So I used a lot of work from like really incredible photographers of the time too. And I would go to the Strand bookstore and spend time there. And I'm doing that same thing now, like, with the Satanic Verses, I'm, reading all the books about the time, newspapers from the time. I recently, if you haven't seen Sinead O'Connor's 1992 SNL video, it's available, when she ripped up the picture of the Pope and read, a cappella sang, Marley's War, and everywhere there's war, until there will no longer be people who think they're superior, there will always be war. And I remember that at that moment, I didn't know who the Pope was, because I grew up so sheltered. And I remember when I watched that, I was like, why is she ripping up that picture? And, and even then people didn't know that she was protesting, child abuse. And
no, she was so ahead of her time. I'm
she
just
was
so excited
so,
about your sequel. I mean, that was just what you said that just now, the Satanic Verses, and remember the fat one, just the Islamophobia that brought, just like the whole thing, and then Sinead and the way she was attacked, that ended her
yeah.
career in the United States. And I was like, I'm so glad you're writing about this. I'm such a big fan of Sinead O'Connor.
Yeah.
And that
I cried.
iconic
I mean, yeah,
moment.
again. But this is the thing, is like I do so much research, and then just like the tiniest little bit will go in the book. But because I read her memoir, I read, she's a great memoir, watch all the videos, so even though like Razia would not know at the time why Sinead ripped up the picture, she does walk into the Strand the next day and it's what everyone's talking about, and then there's a hypocrisy of people like who are like, she shouldn't do that to the Catholic Church. But then, Satanic Verses, so I'm mixing up the timeline. I am combining those timelines into one so that, people see that's what it's like to get offended over someone ripping up an
But
iconic
89 to 92, 93 to 2024, it
not
hasn't
that.
ended. It
No.
hasn't ended. It's not, poor Salman Rushdie was just stabbed, like, what was it,
Oh my
last
God.
year?
Yeah.
I mean, so it hasn't ended. And Sinead O'Connor is still being attacked in places, even though people are now reevaluating. Like, she was one of the first people to speak out against this. And you know what? People did know in their own way. Like, my mother,
Yeah.
staunch Catholic, it was so weird. She happened to be visiting me when I was in grad school in Boulder, Colorado, and I wanted to watch Sinead live. And so we were watching it together, and we saw her rip up
Yeah.
the Pope's picture. And, my mother had always hated Sinead O'Connor. She called her that bald Sinead. She couldn't stand her singing. She didn't like to, she didn't like, she sounded like screaming, blah, blah, blah. But that moment she said, oh, that is the best thing that bald Sinead has ever done. And I was so shocked. And it's because, she said the Pope is always against birth control. And, my mother had been the eldest daughter of 8. Her mother had
Wow.
8 children, which is where, a certain vice presidential candidate would have us all go back, no birth control, endlessly giving birth. My grandmother had 11 pregnancies, 3 miscarriages. I mean, what hell? And that would be our fate unto death. So,
I love this story, by the way.
so, my mother immediately then called up a member of her God Help Me prayer group back in the Midwest to say, to talk to this woman, say, you've got to watch this. You've got to watch this. This is the best. And she kept going on how this is the best thing she called her that bald Sinead has ever done. So, I mean, at a certain level of discourse, the people in power will always attack the truth tellers. But for people who've suffered from these institutions and the power, they will know in their heart when someone is speaking truth to power. And so I'm just like, oh, you cannot write this book fast enough. Please don't take 20 years for the sequel.
At some point, Razia does shave all her hair off, like maybe not like just inspired by Sinead. Or I mean, there is a way that these icons, like, it feels like it's maybe I want their lineages to live, like whether it's Ben McFall or Sinead O'Connor, like I just want them to be honored, and Salman is a controversial character for me, not because of Satanic Verses. I love the Satanic Verses, but just because of what he's saying now about Palestine. It's very problematic. So, but because Razia is in these spaces where people are debating and arguing and not hating each other over it, like like, and that's what Salman talks about too, is like you could have like debate, you know, friendly debate. And so, you know, when Razia is in these like communities with other, you know, South Asian queer artists, radical artists, like they're talking about the satanic verses, and someone is, you know, saying, well, he's saying this, and but then it's just like a conversation. And for Razia, it's so exciting that there's like a dialogue happening, you know. Yeah, I mean, I do want to read this. I want to take a lot. I want to finish this book a lot faster than the last one. And I think I will, because I've learned how to write fiction as I was writing this book. So maybe it won't take as long.
Well, let's hope not 20 years, but I don't want to rush you on it. Now, I don't know if I could, if anyone wants to add questions, put their questions in. I've got quite a few more, but if you want to put your questions in the chat, I'm happy to ask questions on behalf of other people. In the meantime, I've got more questions. This is from a student of mine, Evelyn Chen, who actually has a PhD in Chinese history. She was in my MFA class when you visited last spring, and she had a great question because she writes in English and Chinese. And so she notices, you know, you mix in different languages in this book. And she says, what was the greatest challenge to create a world where English is not the primary language spoken? Or even the language where many references in your text live? What did you feel had to be communicated in a language other than English, and what was okay to leave in English? And how did you decide on that? You do that very smoothly in the book.
Well, I think that was a very hard part when you were asking difficult parts. That was a difficult part. And so because I grew up in Queens, you know, most of the time I didn't understand there were so many languages being spoken. I don't know what the last official number is of how many languages are spoken in Queens, but I think it's one of the most like linguistically diverse places in the world. And so to me, I love the musicality of languages that I don't even understand, you know? And so to me, to have the music of the original language is felt just very important to keep in the text. To have inside jokes for people who only know Punjabi or only know Pashto, or only there's like, I think there's Pashto, Punjabi, Anko, Urdu, Spanish, English. There's a lot of languages in there. And so not as many as are in Queens, but the mother character was the hardest, because the mother never speaks English, right? But if I never had the reader understand a single thing she said, that would have been a problem. And that's where I got Maxine Hong Kingston really helped, because she wrote, I don't remember what essay it is, or I think it was an interview actually, where she said that she tried to keep, she wouldn't directly translate what her mother said, but then again, she would keep the rhythm and the musicality of what her mother was saying. So it would not be a direct translation, but it would be a translation that captured the essence better than a direct translation. So for the mother character and for all the aunties who were not speaking in English, I did often translate what they said, but then I'd always leave a little bit of the original language for the sound of it. And I didn't translate, you know, I didn't translate certain terms, right? Like often, you know, sometimes you'll have like a word and then it's directly translated as a term, like, but instead, like, for example, there's something called wuzu, you know, before we read namaz, before we pray, I mean, I'm doing it now because we're doing we're doing an interview, but like, you know, before we pray, we do, you know, we wash our face and everything. And so the English word is ablution, which is like, to me, like that word, it just sounds like it's like a weird word. I didn't want to put that in there. And so instead I would just have to show the action of what she's doing, you know, and then it just makes the scene more interesting. And then when there's like feeling and thought built into the action of the activity, so people can get, you know, context clues. Remember when you were younger and your teacher would be like, context clues, you know? So I'm like, I try to build in a lot of context clues, even if I'm not directly translating something.
I felt like that worked out so well. I mean, it adds a texture, it does add a musicality, right? It makes it feel like we're not just here. We are, you know, for moments on the sidewalk, we are in Queens, we are eavesdropping, we're flies on the walls of this family, and it worked so well. But I never felt like I'm lost. You know, even if I don't know exactly what they're saying, I could still follow. Did you, kind of picking up on what you said about like the musicality, did you read this all aloud? Are you one of the writers who like has to read everything aloud as you're writing?
Oh, absolutely. Well, because I came from the spoken word world, I read so many of these chapters, you know, out loud for myself, and then often just at events and readings with my writing partners and groups. And interesting, I want to give a shout out to one of my writing partners, Nima Avashia, who wrote, who is actually speaking out a lot against JD Vance, because Nima writes about Appalachia, grew up in Appalachia, and has been, wrote a book growing up Indian and queer in Appalachia. And so there is a way that I'm excited. I always have some kind of writing partner or writing community. And so reading out loud is very much a part of the process. And another book I want to recommend is E.J. Coe's The Magical Language of Others. And I think her writing mentor says to her, Joy, which may not be her real name, but that's the name of the book, you should read everything out loud because it's not on the page, it's here. And her writing mentor also says something that I use for my work, which is that you can't write about anything or anyone unless you forgive them or you forgive yourself for not forgiving them. And so in the process of creating these characters, you know, I really had to do a lot of like either forgiveness or self-forgiveness, you know, in order to create these dimensional characters. Yeah, so definitely I highly recommend reading out loud, because if you stumble over parts of a piece that you're reading, like maybe that's a part that needs a little time, you know, a little more work.
That is great advice for all writers and emerging writers. And so I know you also teach. You were teaching, you know, at the Ruby this past summer, and you were teaching in Fresno, and I'm sure you're teaching in New York right now. But I just want to ask you if you could give some advice. Like, can you talk about your teaching philosophy and creative writing? You know, there's been finally some discussion about kind of moving away from the classic writer Iowa model, in which, you know, the writer is silenced and the only way you get, you know, feedback is like a room full of people like talking about your work in front of you but not to you. And you know, so many people of color have said this is a really miserable experience. It makes me not want to share my writing. I mean, can you tell me something about like how you teach a writing workshop?
Yeah, I mean, so right now, well, I will share that, you know, and because I just want to offer this to people, as, you know, with everything going on in the world. And, you know, instead of a traditional book tour, what I did a lot was I taught grief writing workshops, and that was like a fundraiser for Palestinian Children's Relief Fund or Mecca for Peace. And so that's what I did like a lot during this book tour. And because I was dealing with so much grief around my father and losses of many friends and community members during the pandemic, I just thought, you know, what's the way to enter, speaking of these overlapping genocides in the world, you know, grief. Like, we can speak of it from grief, and then let's also fundraise for these humanitarian orgs. And so that was what I was doing at the Ruby. And so that's been a lot of my teaching this last year. But I do a class called Two Truths and a Lie, writing memoir and autobiographical fiction. And what I do in that class is every basic thing I had to figure out the hard way and learn to write this book, I just put that into like a bunch of techniques and tools, and I teach those. And I used to do it in person, and that was a big part of my writing community. We'd have class for 2 hours, and we'd go out for 3 hours and just hang out and have fun. But since the pandemic, it's been mostly on Zoom, and it used to be for BIPOC writers and allies. But since January, with everything going on in the world, it's now just for BIPOC writers. I will hold classes for allies as well. But I think that because of everything going on, it just felt important to have that space. And I use tools that I learned from some of the radical, you know, so I worked for Teachers and Writers Collaborative. I worked for Urban Word NYC. And in both of those organizations, they were constantly teaching us radical techniques as teachers, you know, teaching us, you know, how to have student-centered learning, how to be a facilitator, not an authoritarian, you know. And I was also part of this organization that doesn't exist anymore, called Women in Literature and Letters. That's how I met my co-editor, Daisy Hernandez. We did Colonize This, Young Women of Color on Today's Feminism. Like 25 years ago, we published that book. This is before people were talking about intersectionality. And we met at Women in Literature and Letters, and they have these, you know, incredible guidelines for critique that I use to this day. And they are guidelines. I don't know if I sent it to you after I went to your class. I'm happy to send it.
That would be great. Do you know, just so for people listening, and who will listen to this video in the future, Do you know where people can look it up? Like, is it archived online?
You know, it's not archived, but what I should do is I'll just put it on my website because I still have the facts from I did say facts from 1999 of when I was faxed the guidelines for critique. And they're a way to run writing workshops that are, like you're saying, I mean, they do have
Hierarchical and
yeah, they still have the writer stays silent till the end. And I think that just in terms of time saves time, but like all the other stuff, that happens that's really, really harmful for writers of color, it kind of like manages that so that that doesn't happen. I hope to put all these together into a book soon, but in the meantime, maybe I'll just put it on my website, these guidelines for critique.
that would be great. Both the idea for a book and also checking your website. Another question, since we're talking about books, what was there anything that you were reading that you would say was like a direct influence on the writing of Roses in the Mouth of a Lion, or that you wanted to, I should say, maybe that you wanted to be in dialogue with?
Well, definitely A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. This book was directly in dialogue with that because when I read that book, again, it's from being from an outer borough, from like an under-resourced, impoverished even community, just being children on the street, you know, again, like there's violence, there's hardship, there's grief, there's pain, like that happened like way too young for these children. And then it's her becoming a writer, you know. So A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, there's one chapter specifically, Sugar Fiends, which is like a direct homage to that book. Because in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, at the opening scene, they're like collecting garbage to sell, you know? And when we were young, we used to collect cans to sell, you know? And so, you know, there is a way that like you know, I was like, oh my God, this is like in a book, someone's writing about this. And you know, but not like it's different, but well, I'll stop there. But then Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Hanif Qureshi's Buddha of Suburbia is an incredible book that really influenced me. I would often look to other countries, South Asian diaspora, specifically in England, because, you know, in the US, there wasn't as much. But I felt like in the writers, British, you know, South Asian writers were doing work that I found really inspiring. You know, Sandra Cisneros, Audre Lorde, of course. My work would not exist without Audre Lorde, and it wouldn't exist without Toni Morrison. Also, I mean, when I read Song of Solomon, that I had an amazing teacher who taught it when I was in my sophomore year, and I remember reading that book and thinking like, oh, a book could be like this, you know, just breaking form and being just so magical and incredible and powerful and revolutionary. So definitely Song of Solomon and Bastard Out of Carolina. It is such an important book to me as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm writing these down so I don't forget. Now there's some questions in chat, so I will read them aloud for you. So this is a good one. Would you ever consider writing a memoir?
I would not because, well, because there's too many people in my life who don't want me to talk about them. And I mean, you could still do a memoir without, I guess, doing that. But I actually don't have a great memory. It might seem like I do, but I do need to do a lot of research. And I do love having the flights of fantasy and the kind of like how I'm like squashing in Satanic Verses and Sinead O'Connor to happen during the same year, you know. There's a lot of anachronisms even in Sugar Fiends, like I mean, in Roses, because like in Sugar Fiends, recycling didn't exist at that time in New York City. So there's a lot of different anachronisms that take place in that book. So I feel like fiction gives me like the two truths and a lie. It gives me the chance to like fictionalize and make things up when reality isn't fitting my plan. So
Well, I mean, I didn't catch that about the recycling because I mean, you know, it was kind of the era though when it was starting to be introduced. Because I remember like in the 70s, they were kind of talking about it, but no one, like, I don't remember doing it.
right.
And then later, like in the 80s, you're like, oh yeah, now we actually take these old things someplace, right? And you do get your coins back,
You
right?
get 5 cents per can.
Yeah. So another question has asked is, are you always writing even if there are no plans to release those works? Or do you
Oh,
now are you always writing with the idea that this will be published, or you hope with the hope of publication?
I'm always writing, and I never thought I was going to get published. So most of what I was writing, I was written like not thinking I was ever going to get published. And actually, this book, it took forever to get. It was very, very difficult to get this book published. Despite any accolades it's getting now, no one wanted it because it didn't fit into any kind of niche. It's like, is it young adult? Is it adult? Like, it's not a oppressed Muslim woman. We can't sell this, you know. It's standing up against Islamophobia. We can't, what this is, you know, people don't want, you know, so there's a way that this book took a really, really long time to find a place. And my other books, it took even longer. But I'm always writing. For me, I started writing when I was a kid, and it was a survival technique, you know, and it was my way to to just be in touch with my inner self and my spirit and my soul even. And so for me, writing is always that. It's a way to just be in constant conversation with my spirit. And I've actually just found in storage just like boxes and boxes of pantoums. There was a time that's a form of poetry that's kind of like, for some reason, I like spent years writing pantoums. I would probably never share this with people, but I just was having so much fun writing them. Like, Google the form. Pantoums are very fun to write, I think. And I just, yeah, I was just always, I need to write. I need to write to stay, you know, to keep myself together. So it's something I do for myself before anything else.
I love that you say that, because I think that's really important. I feel like so much in our culture is you know, it's where America is very capitalistic, right? And so much of art, as you say, you know, in the book, arts education has been removed from schools. And so like, you know, other groups have to kind of form it, and it's under the present, right? It's
Yeah.
always art that gets cut from public school. It's always because it's seen as, oh, how are you going to make a living at it? It's like, well, how are you going to live without it?
Yeah.
Right. And you know, what's interesting is the fascists always go for the art, right? What are they
Mhm.
trying to ban? You
Right.
know, well, school lunches and books. So they must think that, you know, books are as important as eating to keep
Right.
children alive. And so I love that you say you write for yourself. I think that has to be the most important way that anyone writes and creates art. It has to be for ourselves first. I feel like that's where it's vital. I think it's what sustains us. And it's the capitalist part of selling and producing that can make it really toxic. And the second thing I just want to say is, like, one, it disappoints me to hear that this book was hard to sell in the publishing world. But on the other hand, I have to say I'm not terribly surprised, because when I read it, the first thing I noticed was how different it was. Like, you know, it did not conform to any of the stereotypes of like coming of age or queer coming of age or immigrant stories, or even structurally. And that's what I found so fresh and exciting about it. So
Thank
publishers,
you.
take note. You know,
Thank
this is
you.
what you want. This is what
And I
we
will
readers
say,
want.
yeah, no, and I'll say, you know, and thanks to like Aisha Pandey, who was my agent, who like stayed with me with all of, you know, through all of it, through all the rejections. And then also like Carolyn Blakey, who at Flatiron, who did pick it up and was the best editor I could have found, like really helped me you know, connect some dots that weren't already connected. And I also want to say that when I say I'm writing for myself, I also am writing for my community, because when I first was reading these chapters and poems, I was reading them at fundraisers for the South Asian Lesbian and Gay Association, at fundraisers for the South Asian Women X Creative Collective. That's how we would like raise funds, but by throwing these like art events. And so I always felt like I had this audience. So I think there is something about, as writers, we write alone, but I think that the electrical circuit is complete once we have a reader. But the reader doesn't have to be through like a major publisher. The reader could be just like at an open mic, at, you know, sharing with in community. And I did have that really early on. So when I write, I'm still always kind of writing with that audience in mind. And I think and when they would show gratitude of like, oh my God, that made me feel like, or made me remember this thing I hadn't remembered, or made me feel seen, or made me feel less alone. And that also kind of kept me going. And you know, through the obstacles, to know that like there may be an audience member out there who needs this, you know, who needs to hear this right now.
Thank you for saying that. It's so important thing about sharing and community. And that's why like spaces like City Lights, right? And the
Yeah.
Strand are so important in all these organizations because they sponsor readings and they sustain community in a way that is quite radical
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
really important for the art and for the artists, and for all of our survival. Let's see. Another question is about, oh, here's a long one, but I'll read it. So your characters are so beautifully nuanced, even as we are just seeing glimpses of them through Razia's perspective. Some of my favorite passages are when she's watching her mother, like the scene when her mother climbs a cherry tree. Oh, yes, the mother like remembers her guilt and climbs this tree really fast. The one where she's just gotten out of the shower. And the latter, the rare openness of her hair seems to reflect the rare vulnerability of this moment. And then you can see that moment shift and close as her mother ties up her braid. So how do you create such in-depth character details through brief glimpses, sensory fragments like these? Was this something you were consciously doing and editing or shaping, or is it, how would you say, like, I love that scene. Sure, and maybe it doesn't drive the plot forward with a mother climbs, sees the girls and just, oh, I know how to climb up the street, and just climbs farther than, the girls could imagine. And so we see the mother as something other than the mother, but also sees a glimpse into her girlhood. Like, I mean, but that was just,
Yeah.
it added depth and beauty to the character. Did you think I need to add this scene, or did it just come to you, or how did you think of this?
Well, I think that the cherry tree was another character that I wanted to have in the book, and the thing is, Razia's family is from this part of Pakistan that's just incredibly beautiful, the Northwest Frontier province. And so her parents would have known how to like climb trees and get fruit, and were just like more comfortable in the natural world than they were in the city, although they did thrive in the city. Because my training is as a poet and because I love reading poetry, I do read poetry all the time. I mean, given my schedule, sometimes all I do have time to read. I'm always amazed by how poets can just do so much with so little and use imagery to evoke feeling. And so I do think that a lot of scenes like that, I was using a poet's training to capture that. And I wanted to show sides of the mother that were from her childhood, because we are now seeing her struggling as an immigrant in the city, raising kids, which is not easy ever, but like, I mean, obviously it's wonderful too, but under the conditions that she was raising them. So to see that moment with her, and I think that's the thing, is when we talk about writing about characters, like, it's so easy to write about the hard things about people. It's sometimes harder to write about the beautiful, lovely things. I think Naomi Shihab Nye has a beautiful, I'm not gonna be able to quote it now, but just how it's so hard, it's so easy to write about pain because it's heavy and dark and solid, but it's so hard to write about joy because it's fleeting and effervescent, right? And so it is harder to write about things that are joyful, but it's so important to do things like that because, well, we need more joy. And, just because there's no person who is just all one thing or the other. So the mom needed to have scenes like that to kind of dimensionalize her.
And I love that you brought in like the poetry training, and it's not like a traditional flashback, right? We could see her in a traditional novel, maybe we might see, oh, the mother as a child, but he doesn't show it in front of the other children. So you managed to condense time in this beautiful scene. So someone asked if you could, do you have any recommendations of South Asian poetry? Who are you reading? Or also I wanted to expand that just to like, what author books did you read that first made you want to become a writer?
God, with poetry, there's so many. Well, Kazim Ali has a New Moons anthology that you can actually get a lot of poems like all in one place. There's of like more recent South Asian, North American South Asian poets. So that's a really great or Muslim poets actually, but there's a lot of South Asian poets in there. That's a really great collection. I'd recommend that collection. I think that so a book that's new, it's not a book of poetry, but I mentioned Nima's work, Lamia H, Hijab Butch Blues. Lamia is one of my students, and so Hijab Butch Blues is like an incredible book. And Lamia writes under a pseudonym, so I think that that's also like a really amazing thing that I like to share, because in this virtual world, we can write under pseudonyms in ways that we could not before, you know? And so it's just such a powerful, powerful book, Hijab Butch Blues. I feel like I'm always reading incredible books. Now I'm like, I mean, E.J. Koh, I've mentioned, Darfia Faizullah, Ishil Yi Park was the poet laureate of Queens. I mean, she's a Korean writer. I really like the work of Patricia Park as well, who writes YA. Uh, Patricia's been writing some really fun books that I can just eat them like candy, like read them in a day. Yeah, Hanif Qureshi, if you haven't read Buddha of Suburbia, it's just a classic. And I thought Knife, we were talking about this before. I thought Salman Rushdie's, not that he needs any more press promotion from me, but like I thought Knife was a really amazing book. I not South Asian, but Kamila Aisha Moon is a really, really incredible poet. Who wrote a lot about beautiful, beautiful poetry, taking on police brutality in this country. And yeah, I will say if you go to my website, this is a question I've started to create lists of all my favorite Queens writers. For Electric Lit, I did a piece of like all the different Queens writers that I was really loving. Yeah, so but I do feel like my other job, because I have worked at many bookstores, like recommending books is something I do love to do. So please check out some of those recommendations.
I love your shout out to Ishali Park and other Queens writers. She's also started out with spoken word.
Yeah,
She was on Def
we used
Poetry
to be
Jam.
roommates.
Oh, oh
We're
my
good friends,
gosh, you're
roommates. Yeah.
kidding. No way.
Yes, that is one of my soul friends.
Oh,
Yeah.
fantastic. I mean, I
Yeah.
love her Temperature of This Water. I love her work as well. Not
Mhm.
that I love all the authors you've mentioned, but that just jumped out at me because she also had, back when I was teaching on the East Coast, she once visited my class. And so I was so happy. She took the train up. She had to come up from Queens to Massachusetts, and I'm just so grateful. So
She's an amazing writer. I hope I answered that question.
yes, that was great. That was so many recommendations, and people can, again, like, you can read this whole conversation will be archived on the City Lights website, YouTube site. So if you've missed something now, you can at some point, I see Peter is back. He can say like when this will be up, and so people can rewatch or just kind of, fast forward to look at the transcript to get names of, the authors. I couldn't type fast enough to put them in the chat. But thank you. You've just given such really generous advice for writers and for readers. Thank you so much, Bushra. And I just like,
Thank you.
I love your book. You see all my, I don't know if you can see all my tabs of the favorite passages. It's just so inspiring. And if people haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. You can order it from City Lights. They've got copies. I was just there this past weekend. They've got tons of copies of the new paperback, just fresh off the presses. And meantime,
Thank you, Maylee.
hurry up and write that sequel. You've got all of us wanting it. I shouldn't say that. No, I don't want to put pressure on you. No, take your sweet time.
No, I really want
to. If it takes 20 years, we will just keep reading this over and,
I thank you. Thank you for all of your support. It honestly means a lot. Like so much of the tour has been just like friends like hooking me up here, but here's the first time that like I have like a new friend, we just met only because of the book. And thank you, Peter, and everyone who showed up. And it's a lot later in New York, so I hope I made sense because it's way past my bedtime right now. So I go to bed so early. But thank you everybody for showing up, and thank you, City Lights.
Well, thank you both for gracing our virtual halls. And I want to remind everyone, there's also a Spotify music list that is meant to accompany the book. Actually, somebody mentioned it in the chat, so that sounds very exciting. So, Bushra, congratulations for wrapping up your tour and for such an awesome book. Maylee Chai, always a pleasure, and thank you so much for doing the honors. You are just the penultimate kind of interlocutor, interviewer. We're really grateful. And also want to thank you all of you in the audience for hanging out with us. Today's event is made possible by the City Lights Foundation, keeping me dutifully employed and furthering the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, into the future. So long, everyone. Be well. Be kind to each other. We hope to see you all again soon.
Support independent bookstores. All right, everybody. Good night.
Bye.